You're listening to TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour, with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Always great to be back behind the golden Dixie Heritage microphone and to bring you yet another edition of TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour. Our guest this week is Donnie Kennedy. Donnie, along with his brother Ronnie, are, of course, the famous, renowned Kennedy twins, authors of books such as The South Was Right. Donnie has been one of my, shall we say, intellectual heroes for nearly 2 decades now, and so it's an honor to be able to sit down with him and talk with him on the phone and to interview him for today's radio show.
Thank you, sir. It is a pleasure to be here. I always love talking about Confederate issues, as you can tell.
I'm looking at your bio, and I see that you and your twin brother, Ronnie, were born in Mississippi. And so how did two boys from Mississippi wind up in Louisiana?
Divine providence, of course, but since my brother's a Wesleyan, he might not agree with me. But anyway, when we were young, we moved to North Louisiana following our profession in respiratory therapy, and pretty well just fell in love with this area, and I've been here ever since. And Ron is in the southern part of the state of Louisiana, and I'm in the northern part of the state of Louisiana.
And I should already know the answer to this question, but I don't. And of course, it'll help our listeners and those who look at the graphic on this show. If you look at the picture of you and your brother, one of you has a beard and one of you does not. Which one is you and which one is Ronnie?
Well, I'll tell you, like I tell everybody when Ron is not around, I'm the pretty one of the identical twins. It's easy. But actually, I'm the one with the beard, and there's a story behind that beard. Ron and I had, our maternal grandfather was an identical twin, and we could never tell them apart. And I always said that I would not do that to my grandchildren, and when I started having grandchildren, they would confuse Uncle Ron and Pawpaw, so I grew the beard and Ron did not, and that's how the grandchildren distinguish us now.
You know, the first introduction that I had to you was reading The South Was Right. And of course, that was a book that both you and your brother had written together. And several of the books that you've written, you've co-written with your brother. Of course, the book we're going to talk about here in a moment, your Confederate Myth Busters book, I believe you wrote entirely by yourself. But several of your books you co-wrote with your brother. What is that like, trying to co-write a book with someone else?
If it was with someone else, it's much more difficult. I've only co-authored with one other individual, and that was Al Benson. He and I did Lincoln's Marxes together, and that was a lot more difficult. Ron and I being identical twins, and we have essentially the same philosophy, other than he is a Methodist and I'm a Presbyterian. Other than that, we agree just about 100%. So it's very easy. It's almost like writing with yourself. And it's just like this Confederate Myth Buster here. Everything that I write, I send to Ron, and he'll look over it, and he'll make suggestions, criticism, and stuff like that. And the same for me. If he has a book, he wrote Uncle Seth Fought the Yankees. He wrote that. Well, every chapter I read it, I made suggestions and criticism. So we work together all the time, and being identical twins, it was relatively easy. And, of course, with Advent, thank God Al Gore invented the Internet for us, so we could use the Internet swapping files back and forth, and it was so much easier than when we first got started back in late 1980s when we began working on The South Was Right. So it's relatively easy, much easier doing it with your twin brother than someone that's not your twin.
You mentioned it a couple times, so I'm going to ask the question. How did you end up Presbyterian and your brother end up a Methodist?
Divine providence, sir. It's quite easy.
God foreordained that he marry a Methodist? Is that how that happened?
Hey, Ron, he and I will debate the issue, and he'll finally tell me that he was preordained to be, or predestined to be a Methodist, and there's nothing I can do about it. So I tell him that's pretty logical, and I won't argue the fact. But we both grew up in the old Southern Baptist tradition, which was essentially a Calvinist tradition. So But our father's side of the family was Methodist, and I think Ron probably leaned to that side of the family, and I stuck with the old Calvinist tradition.
Is the other one that you're not telling me that you grew up to be a Republican and he grew up to be a Democrat?
Oh, we both. Neither one of us will admit being a Republican, because it's still embarrassing to say that's the only thing that you can vote for nowadays. But neither one of us. Well, originally, yes, we were Democrats, and then we switched over to the Republican. But as I think I've told you before, or maybe someone else recently, I've only voted for two Republican candidates for president, and that was Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump. I've always, in Louisiana especially, we have the unique feature that we can vote independent or third party. And in Louisiana, I look at, if we're going to go Republican anyway, I'm going to let my vote be cast to let people know that there's people with ideas that doesn't match up with the Republican Party. So if there was any danger of Louisiana going Democrat, of course, I vote Republican. So, but I'm a conservative. I'm a libertarian. I'm a conservative. I'm a Christian. So all those factors will play into how I vote, and I think that's the way everybody should be, hopefully anyway.
Back in 2004, which was the time that we actually met face to face, it was at a League of the South convention. I remember telling you about that last night when we were on the phone offline. But I remember asking you about your exploratory committee. You were talking at that time about potentially running for president in the Republican primary, and
Correct.
You were telling me how the purpose of that was to bring Southern ideology into the forefront of political debate. Kind of talk about that for just a minute or two.
Right. We had an exploratory committee, I think, in 2008 during the Republican primary, and the idea was to bring all these issues that we'd been discussing about the South being mistreated and underrepresented by the Republican Party. The Republican Party depends on the South to elect its national leadership. And yet we were being treated as a stepchild of the Republican Party. They were banning Confederate flags or anything Confederate in the Republican Party, and yet we were the ones that was giving them victory. So I said, we need to bring a candidate out that will promote these ideas, conservative, libertarian / conservative values, Christian values, and Southern values into the Republican Party. And that was the whole idea. And we had a good time, and we had some success, but not the success that I really was hoping for, because as you can tell with Nikki Haley, the Republican Party, anytime they get a chance to slap the South down or the Confederacy down, if they think they can win a few votes in the minority community, they'll do it. And Nikki Haley is a case in point.
Well, I'm going to sound like a racist, but I'm not convinced that Nikki Haley was ever a Southerner or even an American.
Well, she does. It's interesting that she does not mind celebrating her pagan Sikh heritage, and which, that's fine with me. If that's what you are, you want to celebrate, that's fine. But she condemns people like us who are Christian Southerners for celebrating our heritage. So she can dress up in the garb of a pagan Sikh, and she thinks that's okay, but if we dress up and fly a Confederate flag, we become anathema to her. So I agree with you. There's something wrong with the woman. She ain't one of us.
Right. Well, you'd mentioned Ronald Reagan, and you had mentioned Donald Trump. What I find interesting about both of those candidates is they are the two Republicans that duplicated what Richard Nixon called his Southern strategy.
Correct.
And
Correct.
And they both won in landslides.
Exactly. And interesting, you mentioned that in one of our books that Ron and I wrote, Why Not Freedom, we talk about the Republican strategy and how Richard Nixon, he played up to the South, but when the NAACP started complaining, he sent his aide to the NAACP and told the NAACP, watch what I do, not what I say. And it was Nixon that ended up with all the reverse discrimination laws and things that pushed his brand of racism onto the forefront and condemn the South in the process. So that's why I wanted to put our issues into the Republican primary. And I'm here to tell you right now, if the Republican Party is ever so dumb to nominate Nikki Haley either as their presidential nominee or vice presidential nominee, I will do all I can to get into a third party movement, and I'll suck as much energy out of the South from the Republican Party to have them defeated, because I think that an avowed enemy is better than a pretended friend. And the Republican Party, if they go with Nikki Haley, they're showing themselves to be nothing but a pretended friend. Just think about it. If you're in a fight, in a trench, fighting an enemy, what would you want? You want to have to face an avowed enemy, or somebody who pretends to be your friend that will end up stabbing you in the back? So I'll do that. And I'm warning. This is just a warning to the Republican Party. If you do that, you can count on it. You're going to have some mad Southerners going after you.
You mentioned in your bio that you've appeared on a number of programs. You've appeared on Oliver North's radio show, Alan Combs. Of course, Alan Combs is in eternity now. I'm not going to speculate on which side he wound up on, but he's on one of them for sure. Bill Maher, the BBC, Al Jazeera Television.
Yeah.
Were those hostile interviews, or were those friendly interviews? Of course, I realize some of those were years ago, maybe before all the hostility towards all things Confederate had began wholesale within the media, but...
Yeah, well, they all were somewhat adversarial, but the two that I really was most amazed by and pleased with as far as radio interview was Oliver North. He was a genuine gentleman, and he was very, allowed me to give my point of view. And he was not adversarial. He asked some pointed questions to keep the thing moving, of course. And then Alan Combs, a liberal, but he was a gentleman, and he treated me like a gentleman. Now, he was hard to handle because he was hard-hitting with his question, much more than Oliver North, but he was a gentleman. He didn't accuse me of being a racist and a Klansman and all that junk that other people would have done. And so I really admired Alan Combs, a liberal, and Oliver North, a very good conservative. They both had good pros. Now, as far as the TV, British broadcasting, fine. They just wanted a story. They wanted to know what was going on in the facts, and I got to give our side of the story. And as a matter of fact, that story was told all over Europe, even into Holland. My twin brother has his wife's relatives that live in Holland, and they thought it was him being interviewed on the BBC in Europe, and which tells me that Europe really needs to know our side of the story. And so I was very pleased with how they turned out. Now, I just recently did a interview with the French and German TV conglomerate. That program should be aired sometime at the beginning of this year in Germany and France. Again, talking about the war, the consequences, why it was fought. It had to be more than just slavery idea. So, and it was a very, very positive interview. Now, of course, when they get to the editing room, I don't know how it will be edited, but they were, in the past, I've been interviewed by them before, and they've been very, very fair and very positive. And the gentleman that was doing the interview, he told me that people in Germany and France were very interested in hearing the rest of the story. They know there's something missing from the story about the American Civil War that they get from the Federals or from the Yankees. So it's very interesting that they were very, very good to give me a good chance to tell our side of the story, and they wanted that side of the story.
Well, that was a good thing. Of course, the reason I think you're so much in demand for these shows is because of the books that you've written. Just The South Was Right by itself was probably the masterpiece. I don't know if you know who Pat Shannon is. He's an investigative reporter. He's somewhat retired now, but for years he was the editor of the American Free Press. And I was on the phone with him, I want to say on Wednesday, he was telling me about his Confederate ancestors. We were recording a segment for what may be a future show. And I asked him, I said, Pat, I said, you have Confederate ancestors, you have Yankee ancestors. I said, you've investigated a number of things as a journalist throughout the years. I said, but then ultimately you came to the conclusion that the South was right. I said, how did you come to that conclusion? And he told me, he said, well, I read this book by James and Walter Kennedy called The South Was Right.
Praise the Lord. Well, I've heard similar stories around. That book, now Pelican Publishing Company, the publishing company for that book has gone defunct. They are no longer in operation, and once the books that are out there are gone, there will be no more of The South Was Right or any of the Kennedy brothers' book that's published by Pelican. Now, we as you know, this book, The Confederate Myth Buster, is by Scopenon Press out of Wake Forest, and Ron and I have several other with Shotwell out of South Carolina. So we'll still be publishing books and printing books and doing books, but Pelican is no longer there. But before Pelican went defunct, I think The South Was Right in all its editions and all its means, paperback printing, electronic printing, and audio. I think it's somewhere right pushing 140,000 copies of that book has been sold. That's a bunch of books for essentially a history book. I am told by those who know that any nonfiction hardback that sells over 100,000 copies is considered a bestseller. So Ron and I do have at least one bestseller, and that was The South Was Right.
And then after I read that book, I remember I was so eager to get my hands on another book I remember reading was Jefferson Davis Right.
And the answer to that question is you doggone right he was right. As you remember reading it, Ron and I wanted to serve as the lawyers in his defense because Jefferson Davis he begged the federal government, try me, go ahead, try me, because he wanted to get the facts in front of the American people and the world. But, of course, the federal government, they're not as dumb as they act sometimes. They knew that they had better not put him on trial. And I believe the Supreme Court Justice Chase, I think he was Chief Justice at the time, he warned several Northerners that was pushing for trying Davis, said, we will lose in a court of law everything we've gained on the field of battle if we try that man. And they never tried him. So Ron and I tried to play the part of his lawyer, giving him his defense against the charge of treason. And by defending Davis, we're defending not only our Confederate ancestors, but we're defending the real America. We're defending the America of the Founding Fathers, North and South, who said that the only legitimate government is that government that exists by the consent, not the conquest, but the consent of the governed. That's what makes America so unique. But that died at Appomattox, and Jefferson Davis understood that.
If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. Another book that I really enjoyed reading, and this was a number of years ago, was The Myths of American Slavery.
In that book, what we're looking at is not defending slavery, but defending the truth about the history of slavery. And that's what these liberals, they don't want the truth. They just want their their narrative of a hate-filled, racist, white South to be spread everywhere. And what I've tried to point out in that book is that there is another side to the story, and it needs to be told also. And we're defending the truth about not defending slavery. As I said, I am a conservative/libertarian. The war wasn't totally over the issue of slavery. It had to do with the right of self-government and controlling the federal government. We cannot control the federal government today because of Appomattox. Real states' rights died. The ability of the states, we the people of the sovereign states, to put a limit on the activity of the federal government disappeared at Appomattox. And I always tell people what was furled at Appomattox was not just the flags of the Confederate States of America, but the U.S. Constitution and Declaration of Independence was also surrendered there. And I think if you look at the deep state and the inability of we the people to control that monster, that leviathan of big government, you'd have to agree with me, something has gone drastically wrong.
This is a more recent book. I remember reading it here a couple of years ago. It may have been more than a couple now, but it was more recently, that you wrote with your brother, titled Punished with Poverty.
Really, people say, well, the war ended, at least the war ended slavery. No, it didn't. It enslaved, it impoverished and enslaved generations of Southerners, black and white, and the slavery was the form of sharecropping and poverty. People just don't realize how impoverished. The South was one of the richest sections of the country, really in the world, in 1860. By 1870, it was an impoverished region where people were literally starving to death. And we point this out in Punished with Poverty. And the reason that the North, and especially Lincoln, went to war was they wanted to keep the rich South to be their milk cow. We call it the milk cow or milk cow of the Union, where they could extract revenue from us to be used for their benefit. And Southerners said, we're not having that, and they seceded from the Union. And, of course, Lincoln fought to bring us back. And in the process, he destroyed the wealth of the South and impoverished generations after generation of black and white Southerners. And when I talk about sharecropping, a lot of times people nowadays think of black people as the sharecropper. No, 60% of the sharecroppers in the South were white people. White families that had, before the war, their family had been relatively secure in their homes and in their property, and were reduced to the form of really debt peonage or debt slavery. Governor Jones of Louisiana in 1942 wrote a scathing article condemning the way that the South had been impoverished and enslaved due to the war and the effects of the war. And that's what that book, Punished with Poverty, is about. And it shows that, obviously, the war didn't end poverty. So it didn't end slavery. It just changed and morphed it into a different form of slavery.
Well, for example, you look at sharecropping. It's like all the work with none of the benefits.
Yeah, well, sharecropping, you became landless peasants. What it ended up being, no different than the peasants in medieval Europe, and you were entitled to keep part of what you grew, but the owner of the land and the property got the first fruits, and then you had to make do, and you had no security. At least the slaves in the Old South, they had security from cradle to the grave. And but sharecroppers had none of that. If the landowner decides this sharecropper is not doing the job I want, he tells him to leave, and he has to pack up. He leaves with what little he can carry with him. He has no home, no Social Security. But under the system of chattel slavery, by law, a slaveholder had to take care of his property, and that meant that if they were old and sick, they had to take care of them. And that's why during the war, so many the slaves in the South refused the offer of freedom, because if they left, who would take care of them? What would happen to their Social Security? What would happen to their family? They had no means of security or gaining food or medicine or anything outside of the plantations. It's a different story, and liberals don't like to hear that, because when you start talking like that, they accuse you of defending slavery. And again, I point out, there's a difference between defending the truth about it, the institution of slavery, and defending slavery.
Well, you talk about cradle-to-grave security. You can make the argument that the progressives or the Marxists or the Democrats or whatever you want to call them, the Pelosiites, that they're basically just creating a modern-day slavery.
Socialism is a form of slavery. That's what our modern, the people who are doing most of the attack on traditional American values, in the Sons of Confederate Veterans, we refer to them as neo-Marxists. They're the new crop of Marxists, a little different than the Cold War Marxists, but their ideology is the same, and their idea is to make the state, the government, is to be the massa in the big White House, and the rest of us have to kowtow and take orders from the massa in the big house. So that's what socialism does for you. It ends freedom, and freedom, especially in the marketplace, is what produces wealth. Socialism, communism, Marxism, it destroys wealth. So it'll make everybody equal, but they'll be equally poor, equally impoverished, and equally enslaved.
You had mentioned that The South Was Right was published by Pelican Publishers and that they are no longer in business. I can remember this would have been back around maybe 2007 or 8, or when I had finished my series of books, Glory and Gray. And I remember sending the manuscript to Pelican and getting a response from them saying that they were no longer accepting Civil War books. They
Correct.
were moving into another direction. Do you think that that was the reason that they ultimately ended up going out of business, that they tried to expand into another market, and that market just obviously didn't respond to them, but they lost the market they had?
Largely, that is correct. The main factor was the death of Dr. Melbourne Calhoun. He was the man that bought Pelican many, many years ago and got it started. Dr. Calhoun was a Christian, a conservative, and very, very pro-South. Unfortunately, those who took over after he died did not have that same feeling, and as he was getting older and of less influence in that organization, they started taking it in a different direction. And that would not have happened if Dr. Calhoun, I believe, if he had stayed healthy and alive, but that's the way it went. Now, Pelican had some of the best pro-South books that I've ever seen. It was a wonderful institution, and it certainly assisted Ron and I tremendously in promoting our books. So I will always be indebted to them, but they have sold out. We cleaned them out. Ron and we went and bought a lot of books they had in storage that belonged to us, or that were our books, so that we can still sell books. If you are interested, you can get hold of the Kennedy twins, and we can still sell some books, but when they are gone, they will be gone, and we are pushing our Shotwell books and Scopernon books and books like that now.
I would assume that when Pelican went out of business, that whatever rights you had signed over to them, you would regain when the publisher is no longer in business. But is that not the case, or you're just not going to?
We feel like that is the case, but that is one of those legal problems that legal minds have to go through to figure out, because they were bought by another company, and that company said they didn't want Civil War books. Out of all the books, I think Pelican probably had 100 titles, maybe not that many, but a tremendous number of good Civil War titles. And the only title that company wanted was one by Dr. Sandy Mitchum, a very good conservative historian, but it's about the Red River campaign. It's not nothing political like the South Was Right. So we were told that that the company that acquired it didn't want the rest of it. It would belong to us, but you have to have a legal judgment on that, and that's what we're working on now.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net.
Extra, extra, read all about it.
And your current publisher, you were saying that they've left Civil War books as well. The Confederate Myth Busters. It was published by a company.
Oh, that's scoping on the Confederate. Yeah, that is the individual that owns that is Frank Pyle, who is the editor-in-chief of the Confederate Veteran magazine, and he loves doing Civil War stuff.
Okay.
And so scoping on is in Wake Forest. They are great. They do some great work. Shotwell out of Columbia, South Carolina, Dr. Clyde Wilson. If that name should be familiar to some of y'all out there, because he is a very, very well-known Southern historian, very, very pro-South. He is the one that's really pushing Shotwell publishing company, and they do not back away. They are full board, 100% positive pro-South with their books. They will not take anything less. So the publishing industry is changing a lot because of the way that books are published now. You can almost do publish on demand, and you don't have to stock big inventories. It's a lot different than it was back in the 1980s and 1990s. The digital age has changed a lot of things, and publishing is one of the things, and that may have been one of the factors that caused the demise of Pelican Publishing. They were not willing to change, I think, and that helps. There's one more straw that caused the rupture of the company.
I know I'm in the process. I started Dixie Heritage Press a couple of years ago, and
yes.
we're about to publish our first novel. It was actually written by a couple of SCV commanders in Georgia. And
is that right?
Yes, sir. About 600 pages of basically the novel it's called From Macon to Manassas, and it's the story of the men of the 8th Georgia Infantry as they enlisted into service, as they went through training, knowing that secession was imminent, as they marched to Manassas, and then the Battle of Manassas, and the book ends with all of them just being happy to have survived the Battle of Manassas. But that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be doing an on-demand publishing situation where, the book will be available at Amazon, the book will be available at Barnes & Noble, we'll have a website for it. And if nobody ever orders a copy of this book, I'm going to be out maybe $150. And of course, if
correct, and that's the way the publishing industry is going, and it makes it so much easier for us to get good books out in front of the public now. But what we do need, I didn't even know about your publishing company, and I've been doing publishing books and working for eons now. We need a way to communicate with all of us who are trying to promote these type of books, so we can pretty well watch each other's back and help each other out.
The North Carolina Heritage Political Action Committee was organized by concerned citizens of North Carolina in 2015 in response to the increased attacks on North Carolina's history and heritage. The North Carolina Heritage PAC supports state and local candidates for public office who pledge and show their support for the protection of Confederate memorials and the preservation of all of North Carolina's history. We all know that Confederate memorials and symbols are the easy targets, and that the end game of our leftist enemies is to erase and rewrite all of history, from the colonies to the War on Terror. If we fight them for our state's rich Confederate history and heritage, we may be able to stop them from their mission of total destruction. Join the North Carolina Heritage PAC now by visiting nchheritagepac.org. Once again, that is www.nchheritagepac.org. And help us on the front lines of North Carolina politics. The mission statement of North Carolina Heritage PAC is that the North Carolina Heritage PAC was created with the purpose of supporting diverse efforts to defend and preserve the heritage, traditions, monuments, cemeteries, flags, emblems, and other legacies of North Carolina history against those efforts to remove, deface, legislate against, alter, and otherwise corrupt or pervert their meaning, history, presentation, and standing in our state. Once again, www.ncheritagepac.org. It's your book, Confederate Myth Busters. It's your newest book. And what inspired you, having written all of the other books, and in some ways you're going back to material you had covered in the other books. In some ways you're going back and covering material that maybe you didn't have the opportunity to go into in detail in other books. But what inspired you to print out this book?
The main thing I really wanted to accomplish was to give my readers some quick answers to hard questions. Ron and I, after doing numerous interviews, I could not count the radio interviews that I've done, and TV also, which adds another dimension of stress to you when you're trying to not pick your nose on camera or whatever, It taught us how, I think, to answer a lot of these questions, and I use a system that I refer to as shock and awe, Confederate shock and awe. Questions, I'll give you an example of a question and an answer to demonstrate this idea of Confederate shock and awe. One of the questions that I always, when we talk about the Constitution and secession, you always get somebody on there to say that demand that you show them where in the Constitution a state has a right to secede from the Union. You could pontificate for hours on that subject, but on a radio interview such as this, you have a limited amount of time. So what I've learned to do is when they ask that question, where in the Constitution do you have the right to secede, you turn around and say, well, sir, are you married? Yes, sir, I'm married. Well, so where in the Constitution does it say that you have the right to have a wife? That's the shock, because all of a sudden, well, that's not in the Constitution. And there's a reason it's not in the Constitution, because the Constitution, sir, is not a cookbook of your right. God gives you right. The Constitution is an instrument to protect you from abuse of the central government. And then you can give them the all part where you give them a little more answer. But that's the idea of the first part of a question, answer to that type of question is to shock them, to get their attention. As in this book, I explain to my readers is that if you're in a discussion with someone that's a partisan on the other side of the issue, most of the time you're not going to convince him to change, but what you want to do is to make those who are standing around listening to this discussion to question that gentleman's view. And that's why I really wanted to write this book. I took all those just thousands of questions and answers, and I distilled them into 9 topics, and then under those topics I have questions and answers. Now, I also, with each topic, I give you an introduction about the Constitution. I give you about a page and a half introduction, and then after the question, I give you a summation. So it's to help my readers and people who are out there who know there's another side to this story, and I want some good answers, and I want to be able to answer these questions. Here's a book for you, the Confederate Myth Buster. We're looking at the myths that are about the South, the Confederacy, and we're busting them wide open.
You talk about a lot of different things. You said you primarily broke it down into 9 categories, but in those 9 categories, you talk about a lot of different things. But, for example, 100 years of failure.
I remember when Nixon was elected president and how everybody down here was so excited because finally we got a conservative president, Nixon. He's going to change all the problems. Well, it didn't happen. Then we elected Ronald Reagan, the best president in my lifetime, Ronald Reagan. And if y'all remember, listen to his inaugural address, his first inaugural address. When I listened to it, I told Ron, John C. Calhoun could have written and given that address. And I thought, well, surely we're going to win now. And conservatives was just jumping up and down. Oh, yes, we're going to win. Well, it didn't. That didn't happen. Then we had Newt Gingrich's conservative revolution taking over Congress, and I heard conservative, finally, we're winning. Well, after Newt Gingrich and Ronald Reagan and Nixon, what did we get? We get an Obama. We're not winning. We're having some tactical victories, but no strategic victories. And that's the difference. And remember, you just got through talking about Manassas, the Battle of Manassas. That was a wonderful, wonderful tactical victory. But who won the war? It wasn't us. You see, you have to use tactical victories to cause strategic change, and a strategic victory will ultimately come. And this is why I say in 100 years we've had a lot of conservative victories, tactical victories, but you look in the past 20 years, we're much more socialist, liberal, secular humanists today than we were even 20 years ago. If you go back 50 and 100, it's even worse. We are losing. We're not winning. Yes, we can have a tactical victory. Trump being elected was a tactical victory. But to make a strategic victory, we'd have to change things in Washington, D.C., so we, the people of the sovereign states, could nullify any egregious action of the federal government. That's how you bring the federal government under control. And that wasn't John C. Calhoun that said that. That was Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, the author of the Declaration of Independence and the father of the Constitution. Go read the Kentucky and Virginia Resolves. That's exactly what they're saying. We cannot control we cannot depend on the federal government to control itself. I don't care if you elected every man in Washington, D.C. today as a Ron Paul delegate and put him in Congress. In 20 years, those people will be gone, and you'll have the same old system that we've got right now. We've got to get back to real states' rights. And in real states' rights, we, the people of the sovereign states, we dictate to the federal government. The federal government does not dictate to us. So that's what we're talking about, making a strategic change. We've had 100 years of conservative failure, and another 100 years will put us in a Marxist gulag.
You talk about Ronald Reagan being the best president of your lifetime, and mine as well. Of course, we have a lot of hope in Donald Trump as being the next Ronald Reagan. Is it a coincidence, or is it planned that the two men who have the most potential of thwarting what I'll call the globalist agenda or the New World Order were both Hollywood celebrity movie and TV actors? In other words, do you think that they're really what they appear to be, or do you think that they're both really playing a role and the intention is for them to not do anything, just entertain us conservatives and us constitutionalists so that we think that they are?
Regardless whether that is the case or is not the case, the fact is that is what is happening. Because right now I have friends around me, they thank God for Donald Trump, we're going to save the world. No, we're not. We're going to do the same thing we did when Ronald Reagan got elected. We'll push the liberal agenda back a little bit, and then they'll come on like steamrollers. The problem is that the federal government cannot be controlled. Our founding fathers gave us a system where you could control the federal government. Again, go back and read Jefferson and Madison's Kentucky and Virginia Resolves. It was in 1797, I believe, or 98, and they'll clearly tell you that we, the people of the states, we are sovereign. It is not the federal government, and if we have that system in place, then we can control the federal government. It don't matter who is president, as long as we, the people of the states, are sovereign. Now, let me give you an example. You remember when Arizona said that their borders were being invaded, and what were they going to do? Well, they were going to enforce, the state was going to enforce existing federal law. And what did the federal government tell them? No, you cannot do that, Arizona. You cannot enforce existing federal law. You have to just take it as it is. You see, Arizona is not a sovereign state. No state is sovereign. The federal government is sovereign. It has all the power, and we, the people at the local level, have none. And that is why Ron and I keep talking about we have to have a strategic change. We've got to put back into place that system of government that our founding fathers gave us that existed prior to Lincoln's unlawful, illegal, immoral invasion, conquest, and occupation of we, the people of the South.
Well, you had a chapter of that, Lincoln versus Davis.
We're looking at the difference in these two men. It's difference in their, not only their ideology, but this is something that a lot of people, unfortunately, a lot of Southerners don't realize. Lincoln was not a Christian. He was a secular humanist at best, and maybe even an atheist at worst. But Davis was an avowed Christian. He was an Anglican. That was back when the Anglican Church was a real Christian church, and they were very conservative and followed the Scriptures. His father was a Baptist, and he praised both sides of his family, and he was a dedicated Christian. And Lincoln was not. Lincoln's wife, the week after Lincoln had been shot, Lincoln's wife said that her husband was not a Christian, quote, in the ordinary sense of the word. Now, his law partner said the same thing. All the people that were closest to Lincoln said that he was not a Christian. He did not believe in the divinity of Christ, did not believe in the inspiration of the Scripture, and that he really only went to church so that he could mock and make fun of the people who were in church. You can look on a list of the presidents of the United States and church affiliation from Washington to even Trump and even Obama, and you'll find church affiliation. Abraham Lincoln is none. There is no church affiliation. He was never baptized. He never took communion. He never tithed. He was never a member of any denomination or any church. So we're trying to contrast, not compare, but contrast these two leaders. One believed in local control, states' rights. The other one believed in centralized power and all-powerful, almighty, imperialist type of government. That was Lincoln. Davis believed in local control and local government and states' rights.
And so you talked about Lincoln being a secular humanist and not being a Christian, and then before you talked about Christians, you know, the Christian basis of the Confederacy and of the culture and so forth, and you'd also talked about how if we don't return to that, how we're going to end up with communism and Marxism. You actually had a chapter in Part 3 called Christians Marching with Marx.
That is correct. We're talking about here how so many of our evangelical leaders, they actually worship the icon of Lincoln, and they believe him to be a great Christian man, and I'm pointing out the fact, no, he was not. And as a matter of fact, he led the country toward secular humanism. Back in the 19th century, 1800s, they were referred to as free thinkers. And what they meant was they said they had freed themselves of religious superstition, such as the Bible and God and that sort of thing. And these free thinkers were the prerequisite of the modern-day secular humanists. Now, it's an interesting thing you brought up there in our book, Ron and I, in our book, Punished with Poverty. We have maps showing church attendance in the United States. Do you realize that the states with the highest number of church attendees are in the South, with only one exception, and that's Utah? All the other states have the lowest church attendance, and they're in New England, on the West Coast, and out west. Charitable giving of your means to charity. Mississippi, the poorest state in the Union, post-Appomattox, its people give per capita more of their meager earnings to charitable institutions than the people in Massachusetts, one of the richest states in the Union, and they're miserly. You see, this is the mindset. This is the difference between a Christian people and a secular humanist people. The secular humanists, they think of themselves, whereas the Christian people, their mind is on God, and God says, do unto others.
You had talked about, also a moment ago, you'd mentioned Ron Paul and Ron Paul delegates, but you have a chapter in Part 3 that says Ron Paul is too radical.
That came about, I was a delegate for Ron Paul during his campaign for presidential nomination. During the election, some of my friends, not really astute in politics, they condemned me for supporting Ron Paul because they said Ron Paul was just much too radical for them, that they would be more comfortable supporting Barack Hussein Obama. And that just shocked me to my core. I couldn't believe that a modern day American would think that Ron Paul is too radical, but Obama was a cat's meow. He was just fine. So I wrote an article, and essentially I compared what Ron Paul believed in to what the Founding Fathers believed in, and contrast that with what Obama and the liberal secular humanists believe in. And my conclusion was that if people agree that Obama is the better choice, then certainly Ron Paul was too radical, but he was not too radical for men like Patrick Henry and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson.
You know, from a marketing standpoint, I had said this back in 2007, 2008. From a marketing standpoint, Obama rhymes with Osama, and Hussein was, you know, Saddam Hussein, you know, those were public enemies number 1 and 2 in this country. And from a marketing standpoint, I wouldn't try to sell a product that was named Hussein Obama.
Exactly.
But yet the Democrats not only did it, they did it with impunity, and allegedly the country supposedly voted for him. You know, I almost wonder if the whole thing wasn't supposed to be a big, shall we say, political middle finger to the bulk of America, that you don't matter anymore, that we can put up something that you totally oppose and you have nothing that you can do about it.
Well, and you're right, but look who was running against Obama in both cases and how they treated the man with kid gloves. They would not attack him. They would not go eye to eye and say, why were you associated with these radicals? Why did you say this? In your book you said this, and it's a racist statement, and it is a pro-Muslim terrorist type of statement. Why would you say that? But they wouldn't. They would not even touch him. They treated him with kid gloves. So, I blame the Republicans and the spinelessness of the Republican establishment for allowing Obama to be elected and reelected. So, and it may have been. Some people are into conspiracy. Yeah, that could be a conspiracy that pushed him forward for that reason, but I think it's just dumb Republicans more than anything else. You don't have to have a conspiracy when you got a dumb opponent in the Republican Party. The establishment in the Republican Party has proven itself to be as dumb as a box of crooked nails.
Talk about the Republican establishment. You have a chapter titled The Wall Street Journal, and that's about as establishment Republican as you get. The Wall Street Journal's Confederate animus.
Yes, I have a friend, I've already mentioned the name, Dr. Samuel Mitchum. He wrote a book on, I believe it's on the Vicksburg campaign. Dr. Mitchum, he's an accredited historian. He was voted one of the most respected historians in the history department at a local university here by the student body, not by the faculty, but by the student body. He wrote a book on the Vicksburg campaign. Well, Dr. Mitchum, he takes every opportunity to remind his readers who was right and who was wrong in that war. And he didn't have anything nice to say about Sherman. He didn't have anything nice to say about Grant. He told it like it was. Well, Wall Street Journal did a review of his book, and they just tore him apart. And they tore him apart because he did not kowtow to political correctness. And of course, I wrote this article in response to the Wall Street Journal's editorial book review on Dr. Mitchum's book. And like I say, Dr. Mitchum is a fine Christian gentleman, very conservative, very, very pro-South. And he's a member of my local SCV camp, and he's one of us. And he told me, he said, if the choice is between being accepted by being PC or being kicked out, I prefer to be kicked out. And more or less, he left the academic field, he said, because it was too anti-Christian and anti-South. So he's as far as I'm concerned, he's one of my best friends, and I'm proud to know him. That's why I wrote that article about the Wall Street. And it gives you an example of what's going on in the media. Right now, we're working with the Sons of Confederate Veterans trying to get our message out to the general public. And you'll be surprised how many radio stations refuse to carry our ads when they see it's being paid for by the Sons of Confederate Veterans. They say, no, we can't have anything to do with you people. And also newspapers. Try to get a newspaper to run an ad. Ron and I tried to get them to run an ad in the Baton Rouge newspaper in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. We had a check for $2,200 to pay for an ad. The ad was professionally done, ready to go, nothing derogatory, all positive, and they refused $2,200 because it didn't fit the narrative that they were pursuing. So, I give credit to people like Dr. Mitchum and people such as yourself who are willing to go out there and give our side of the story. And I'm pushing the Sons of Confederate Veterans very hard to get busy and more involved in pushing our narrative, the positive view of the South in front of our people. Well, I'll give you an example. In Louisiana, for example, when they took Robert E. Lee's statue down off of Lee Circle in New Orleans, 70% of the people of Louisiana was opposed to that. Yet, they did it anyway because in New Orleans, 55% of the people were in favor of it. But that 70% is decreasing daily, weekly, yearly. In 5, 10, 15 years, if we don't give our people this message that you are so good at giving, Ed, right now to the people, if we don't get this to the general public, we're going to have generations growing up believing the neo-Marxist narrative about the South, about conservatism, and about Christianity. So I'm pushing the Sons of Confederate Veterans to do more. We're buying ads, we're buying newspaper stuff, we're doing things for a change. Hopefully we can get the message out using this and other methods. And, of course, Ron and I are still writing and promoting books. I think that has its place also. But it's going to take more than writing a book to change the narrative.
So how does someone get a hold of your books? How do they order a copy? I know they're available on Amazon, but I'm sure you'd rather they purchase them directly from yourself.
I would prefer they go to Amazon. Go to Amazon. Quite frankly, Ed, I do not have the time to take care of all. If everybody started ordering books from me, I don't have the time doing everything else that I'm doing. So go to Amazon. And the good thing about going to Amazon is when they see a lot of people buying those books, I get bumped up and we get better billing. So buy it from Amazon. But if they want to go to KennedyTwins.com, they can go there and be directed to other places where they can get autographed copies. I have a company in Mississippi, Flags and More in Mississippi, Florida, Mississippi, and they'll be glad to sell autographed copies. Ron and I go over there and autograph books for them, and they help us push those books. So just go to the Kennedy Twins website, www.kennedytwins.com, and you'll see on there how to motivate and get around to ordering those books.
Definitely want to thank you for being on the show today, and I want to encourage all of our listeners to get their hands on a copy of Confederate Myth Buster as soon as they possibly can.
Thank you, sir, and I appreciate being with you. It's always a pleasure.
And that was our interview with Donnie Kennedy, the Kennedy twin, co-author of The South Was Right, and I trust that there was something thought-provoking and encouraging to you as you listened to it. During the interview, Donnie and I talked about a novel that was going to be published by Dixie Heritage Press, that novel being Macon to Manassas, which was co-authored by John Wayne Dobson and Walter Kevin Sark. That book is now available on Amazon.com. In fact, earlier this week, the ebook or the Kindle version, the paperback, and the hardback editions all went live on Amazon.com. So go to Amazon.com, type in Macon to Manassas. That's the city in Macon, Georgia, and the city in Virginia, Manassas. Type in Macon to Manassas. The book should come up, and you should have your choice between Kindle, paperback, and hardback, and order that book. I promise you it will be a great read, and you will be glad that you did. Also, I'd like to encourage you to go to the KennedyTwins.com website and look at all the great offerings that Donnie and his brother Ronnie have there. Go to barnesreview.org. Check out the Barnes Review. Of course, they are the TBR in TBR Radio. And go to www.dixieheritage.net. That's my website. Sign up for my free weekly email newsletter. And when you do, I will also send you free of charge, no cost, no obligation, a copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. So from all of us here at TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, until next week, God bless.